Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Greetings. It is so good to be with you. I am broadcasting live now from sunny California. I can't tell you how good it is to be back visiting family. And I want to give you your public service announcement for tomorrow. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and if you're obnoxious like we are in my family, you better make sure you wear some green so you aren't pinched. We would harass each other as kids, and let's be real, even as adults. Are you wearing green? We just start pinching each other. So when everyone tries to claim that they're wearing green underwear, right? What you can't see, you can't get pinched for. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. A little nudge of a reminder. I love to talk here on Trending about how important it is to live liturgically within our homes, especially when we have kids, or even whether your spouse is or isn't Catholic, does or doesn't take their faith seriously. It is so important that we're celebrating some of the great feasts throughout the year, and St. Patrick's Day is one of those days that's become rather secular, but at the heart of it is a Catholic celebration of the saint known as St. Patrick. And I want to just remind you a little bit about him. We'll discuss more tomorrow, but I really want to give you a few ways how you can bring St. Patrick into your home. Growing up as a kid, I was homeschooled. Yes, you may not have known this. I don't like to identify as a homeschooler, but I was homeschooled. Anyways, I digress. We had an incredible neighbor next door, and every St. Patrick's Day she made so special for all of us, and it's become one of our favorite holidays in our home. And I'm so excited now that I have a little kid and nieces and nephews. I started, celebrating and doing some of these things with my niece last year, of helping them to expand their imagination behind both St. Patrick and our faith, as well as, ideas such as hidden treasure and leprechauns. I remember my next door neighbor, we'd show up at her house for dinner every St. Patrick's Day. We'd have these big, massive feasts, and there would be little leprechaun footprints all over the house, and there would be, little messes and mischief throughout the house that the leprechauns had done things to cause chaos when they visited, and there would be little piles of buried hidden treasure of chocolate gold, fun things that you can do with the kids, and then sit down and talk to them about who St. Patrick is, a great saint who liberated Ireland after, at 16, being taken to Ireland as a slave, and was later returned to Ireland and converted Ireland. This is why St. Patrick, who himself isn't Irish, is known and celebrated among the Irish people, as is his feast day. It's a day to celebrate our faith and the tradition of feasting behind our faith. And some of my favorite ways to do so is to eat what we ironically consider the St. Patrick's Day feast of the poor man's food, of soda bread, corned beef and cabbage, and potatoes. And it's ironic because if we really tie this in, we could talk to our kids about how the poor man's food that we eat, that we celebrate as this great feast, we eat the poor man's food because we are poor without Christ, and how the Irish people, prior to the preaching and evangelization of St. Patrick, were poor. They were void of Christ in their lives until one man was willing, even in the midst of having been taken captive and made a slave as a teenager, was willing to go back to Ireland and evangelize and share the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ. A pretty incredible story. And with everything from dyeing all your food green to, I remember one of my favorite tricks that our neighbor used to do is she would pour all of us a nice, beautiful goblet of apple cider. And that apple cider, she would put Pop Rocks in it. And a little bit of green food coloring, and so when the apple cider would go in, it would bubble up, and she'd say, "Oh my goodness, the leprechauns got to something else." But it was so much fun. It made me fall in love for a moment with our faith and to have a little bit of imagination. And even things such as the footprints of the leprechauns leading to treasure. Gold is given to Christ at his birth. It's one of the 3 gifts given by the 3 wise men. There's so many times we can make with gold being a symbol of royalty. Christ is king over us. And again, incorporating all of those fun green foods. Maybe it's one day if your kids don't eat vegetables where you can get them to eat a lot of vegetables and be really excited about it. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. It is Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. And any question goes, questions that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily ask your mom or your sister, but we'll answer here with a faith-filled perspective. We'd be glad to take them. Joining me in just a moment will be Jim O'Day, the Executive Director of Integrity Restored. We're going to talk about the virtue wars on men and how you can build what the world wants men to disregard, which is what the church is calling you to as a man. We'll discuss the most useful tool for responding to pro-abortion questions. We'll also cover how body dysmorphia isn't just something that teenage girls struggle with, but how young men and men of all ages actually struggle with, but is rarely discussed. We'll discuss how men can help women deal with this hypersexualized culture of relationships we live in, and I'm so excited to dive in. So joining me now is Jim O'Day, the Executive Director of Integrity Restored, and he has worked for over 25 years in everything from development, sales, executive management, defense, and homeland security. Now is in the nonprofit world working at Integrity Restored, helping people who are struggling from sexual addiction, especially struggling with pornography addiction or pornography use, whether your loved one is using pornography and it's negatively impacting you, or maybe you are. IntegrityRestored.com is an incredible resource. We'll post a link to them on social media now, and we'll also include that in the podcast notes for today's show. But what we want to discuss is this virtue war that men are experiencing. As we know, a few years ago, the American Psychological Association labeled masculinity as, quote, toxic. Masculinity was also labeled on a number of university campuses as something toxic if lived out on campus. And when they listed specifically what they meant, they essentially listed what are known traditionally as masculine virtues, actually good masculine virtues. We've done whole episodes on this. We'll include links actually to some of that conversation in the show notes, because I think it's important to understand this. So if you want to catch that, subscribe at relevantradio.com/trending to the podcast, and we'll include a link there. But what I want to talk about now, Jim, welcome to Trending, is how it's led to this approach of sometimes self-rejection for men when it comes to their mission or what they're being called to live out, but everyone's saying disregard, don't do that, ignore sex differences, ignore responsibility. How do you build, Jim, what the world wants men to be when they're also telling men to disregard those very things?
I think that's the great question, Timmerie. And my definition goes all the way back to Aristotle, and it's really simple. A man needs to strive for excellence and virtue in all areas of his life. So what does that mean? That means being the best brother, the best friend, the best husband, the best father, the best employee that you can be. But you can only do that if you build virtues. And there's many, many virtues that we could dive into, but I've only picked a couple of them. Courage, personal responsibility, integrity, sacrifice, and loyalty. And I think if men understood and just paid attention to those areas of their life, what a different world.
These 5 virtues that you're referring to, and just to repeat them if you're listening, I think is something that kind of gives us a roadmap of, okay, the world's telling me be a man, but then it's also saying don't be a man. So what do I focus on? You mentioned courage, personal responsibility, integrity, sacrifice, and loyalty. How have you seen these as integral in developing, and how do you develop them?
Great question. All of them are something deep inside our souls that we aspire to. But all of those virtues also are not necessarily instinctive. You have to develop them. Let's take integrity, for example. In my work at Integrity Restored, one of the things I see often is we let ourselves have these little slips. We allow ourselves, Timmerie, these self-soothing habits. We allow ourselves to say, well, it's just a little white lie. Or what she doesn't know won't hurt her. These type of things. And when we allow ourselves to fall in those little ways, well, over time they snowball, don't they? And those little ways start to become bigger ways. And it's the same thing with the positive virtue of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what's right even when you're fearful. Mm-hmm. And so
Acting
when we build these,
fear.
when we build these little things, in small ways in our daily lives, quietly in our daily lives, it doesn't have to be these huge statements or TikTok videos or Instagram posts, just little things we can do in our lives every day as men. Well, that's going to help us grow to be that man that God wants us to be, and to be able to be the best husband, father, brother, friend, etc. But we have to develop those things. We have to work on them like a muscle every day, to build those habits in our lives and those characteristics and qualities that are so important to who we are by nature of our being as God's sons.
And it goes against, like you said, what the culture wants us to often disregard. For example, I'm away out of town for a week right now, and my husband is away, and I've heard multiple people make the joke, oh, while the wife's away, making these jokes. And of course, it's a joke. It's something funny. But jokes tend to speak something truthful about what we believe, maybe not ourselves, but as a culture. And that's a great example when you're talking about how important integrity is, that in little things, those little things matter because they set the precedence of whether or not we'll have integrity in big areas. And especially for you working in the area of people who are struggling with pornography use and how that impacts relationships and marriages. Developing or regaining a sense of integrity, I imagine, is a huge part of that healing journey in a relationship.
It's a critical part of recovery. If we don't do that, then we're constantly white-knuckling the battle, right? And we're trying to heal and succeed by the strength of our own will. And that's not enough. And the strength of our own will, honestly, is not enough in the development of the virtues either. We need God's grace in the development of those virtues. And then we also need that community and accountability as men to be surrounded by brothers who will hold us accountable to those things. And I think that is tremendously missing today in our society.
So let's talk about some of the other virtues that you mentioned that men should focus on. You mentioned courage, personal responsibility, sacrifice, and loyalty. What comes next? What should be focused on?
So if we want to talk about personal responsibility, I just think we're in a space now, Timmerie, in society and culture where nobody wants to be personally responsible, right? It's so much easier to blame somebody else.
Everything has a legal waiver so that no one's culpable for anything. And it's funny, as a culture, we also want to say, okay, that's fine, I won't hold you responsible. Just let go of this idea of fear of responsibility.
Well, yeah, and it goes even further than that to the misunderstanding of Scripture, do not judge lest you be judged. No, there's certain things in this world, in this culture that we see that, I'm sorry, it's white, it's black and white, right or wrong. And we can't just keep saying, well, no, it's okay. It's that moral relativism that, well, if it's okay for them, it's okay for them. It's not okay for me. Well, that's not a virtuous life. We have to have personal responsibility for our own actions, the actions of our family, and then to help those that we love and care about and that God puts in our circle of influence to understand the truth, to know the truth. We have to share that with them.
It's so easy to start to be self-centered, whether in marriage, relationships, or even as a single person. How do you start making simple sacrifices, especially as a man, to start to develop your character and overcome this disregard for being committed or attached to anyone?
Wow. We did a show, our last show was about what husbands can do for their wives, right, during this Lent. But one of the things I think I see all the time from young men now in my work here is that they are completely unwilling to sacrifice because the world revolves around them. And here's the problem with that. You're never going to be satisfied. You're never going to be happy. The way to find happiness and meaning is when you as a man recognize the world revolves around others. Your job is to sacrifice and serve others. That doesn't mean you're going to have a terrible life and you're going to be sad, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying true joy is found when we give. And so many young guys today that I talk to, they don't get that at all. The art of sacrifice, the meaning of sacrifice, is completely lost on them because they're not used to being uncomfortable in any way. Mm-hmm. We got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's part of life.
Yeah. And it's hard, I think, especially in my own life. I'll experience, men sometimes that I'm around, sometimes they just ask for something. You feel like such a burden. Like, even, in an airport, for example, because I've been traveling, to ask someone to help get a bag down from up above. Either there will be a gentleman of the older generation who will help you get that bag down before you can even ask. Or there will be someone of my generation who it's like, oh, like this sigh, like, oh yeah, like this resignation to doing something that he's obliged to do, rather than willingly being able, willing, and capable to make this mini sacrifice for someone who's maybe traveling alone with a baby,
Yeah. And there's a scarier thing happening. Men are afraid to even do that. Because will the woman be offended? Wow.
Yeah, will she reject?
What is going on? That's crazy, Timmerie. It's crazy to me. I don't care. I'm going to get her bag. I don't care. I'm going to hold the door for her. You know what? No, we can't allow that kind of madness to take over.
Right. And I think moments like
Sorry,
that.
I'm getting fired up.
No, I think this is important, Jim, because I've talked to a lot of my male friends about this. In light of the current radical feminist culture we live in, are you less inclined to open a door for a woman or offer help or in all these different situations? And unanimously, I hear men saying yes, and men that I highly respect. And I think that, if you're listening, like, Jim, my attitude is, you as a man have to be willing when someone's like, oh, you're chauvinist, oh, you're sexist, say, yup. Like, okay, yup, okay, so if that's what this is called, yup, then I am. And, sometimes not even explaining yourself anymore. It's funny, this is something I admire about my husband when he's called out by, family who disagree with him about various, ways that we are living out our Catholic faith. As people get annoyed and criticize them, okay, you want to call me this or that? Sure, okay, yup, that's what I am. There's this confidence in saying, okay, if you want to call me names, if you want to be offended by me, that's okay. Sure, call me that. That's fine. And continuing to go on your way of not being afraid to do the right thing.
I had a situation holding the door for a young lady, and she really berated me that she didn't need me to hold the door for her. And I said to her, well, that's okay, but it's how my mom raised me. And I walked away. I'm not going to get into a debate with her. It's not my job to change her mind. But it's my job to be a gentleman, period.
Period. Yep. Period. Okay, let's talk about loyalty, because all of this, from courage to sacrifice, it's rebuilding those masculine virtues that the culture says disregard, don't worry, it's not that big of a deal. But I will say, real women want men of virtue. So how do you live out loyalty in your life in a culture where we really lack those bonds of loyalty that are traditionally built into our families due to generational breakdown of the family, and even the fact that we've lost these in long-term friendships? How do you start to show loyalty when maybe you've never had a relationship that's expressed that or modeled that to you?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest problems we're facing, right? Is that so many young men today don't have a model of loyalty. And look, I grew up as the child of divorce. My parents were divorced when I was 2. But you can learn loyalty from other areas of your life, friendships, sports. And what loyalty means is that you're putting, again, the other before self, right? Many times it would be a lot more self-serving not to be loyal for whatever reason. You can think in business environments, on sports teams, even in family dynamics. But it's not what we're called to be. And so are we going to fail? Yes. But we should always strive for that virtue of loyalty. And if you cultivate that virtue and grow that virtue, your relationships will be so much better, so much deeper, so much more profound. You'll be surprised how beautiful life is, even in those sticky moments where loyalty was like, oh, that was a tough one.
That's Jim O'Day, the Executive Director of Integrity Restored. We're going to come back and we're going to discuss body dysmorphia, how it's not just something that girls struggle with, but young men and men as well. We'll also dive into how you men can help women deal with hypersexualized relationships. It's our weekly Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. Have a question for Jim or I? We'd be happy to take it. The number's 1-888-914-9149. You can also ask your question now on social media, especially Instagram, on my story at Timmerie. That's Timmerie.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
It's our weekly Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. Any question goes. I'd love to hear from you. The number's 1-888-914-9149. I'm going to give you the tactic in just a moment here for the most useful tool for responding to pro-abortion questions. You don't have to have all the answers, but you need this one tactic that will help you in telling the truth about the baby and telling the truth about the pro-life issue when people have questions or challenge you. Before we go there, though, joining me now is Jim O'Day, the Executive Director of Integrity Restored. We're going to talk about body dysmorphia and how this isn't just something that women struggle with, but it's also common among men. And I find it fascinating when we talk about body dysmorphia. So many young girls struggle with this idea of their eyes are too far apart, their foreheads are too big, their thighs are too thick, you name it. But it's actually a mental health disorder that men struggle with as well, when they can't stop thinking about one or more of their perceived defects or flaws in their own appearance. And one of the predominant means of bodily dysmorphia is muscle dysmorphia among men, especially with this preoccupation that many men will have, believing that their body's too small or puny and inadequately muscular. I remember a friend of mine, Jim, when we were in middle school, determined that his ears were just too big, and that to him, he fixated on his ears, and that is what was getting in the way of his happiness. So he had his ears pinned back, and to him, he thought that that would fix all of his problems. Did it? No. Did it make him a little more confident in his body? Sure. But I want to discuss with you how you see bodily dysmorphia playing out in men today.
Sorry, I was taking a sip of my Irish coffee here. With a name like O'Day, I've got to celebrate the whole week for St. Patrick's Day. one of the things so the body dysmorphia is really interesting. We've known and talked for a long time about how women have really struggled with this. And actually, you know, there's a huge industry of plastic surgery that caters to women who are struggling with body dysmorphia.
Right.
And now more and more, there's organizations, plastic surgery centers catering to men. And there's some common ones I hear in my work with men. The first being concern about the size of their genitalia. The second, their musculature, that they're not big and muscular enough. And the third is they're too hairy. So they're getting, you know, permanent hair removal. And it's just bizarre that, I mean, this is a hundreds of $1 million industry now for women and men to get their bodies changed from what God gave them. And some of it is, there's no question, we've talked about it on the show so many times, social media, certainly pornography, especially when it comes to men and their concern about size. And just general, what I would call marketing of this perfect human body and what that looks like for a man. You know, six-pack abs, no hair on his chest. Well, that's not necessarily how everybody looks. And that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. There's a cool video out there that talks about the Spartans. And, you know, if you've seen that movie 300, all these Spartan guys are jacked, right? They are just ripped and bulging muscles, and their bodies are all oiled, and it looks awesome. And this guy is a martial artist who actually is also a history professor. And he said, I just want everybody to know that's not how the Spartans looked, right? They didn't have all that time to lift weights and eat to eliminate the deficit that they experienced in their normal life as a soldier. These guys were skinny. They were thin. They were strong, of course, but they weren't jacked because their muscles didn't have that opportunity to grow that way because they were working all the time.
They were active, constantly burning, constantly moving, not necessarily the amount of food you'd imagine they'd have. You know, there's a reason there used to be big feasts before war because they had famine when they were at war.
Exactly right. And yet we have this preoccupation as a society with what we're supposed to look like. Now, I'm the first one to tell you, we should all be healthy. We should all be in good shape. And I say it for so many reasons. One of them is that as a man, you should be able to take care of your family. And in order to do that, you're going to need to be in good shape. But that doesn't mean you need to be an Adonis. That doesn't mean you need to be Arnold Schwarzenegger at his prime, right? It means you need to be healthy. And I think if we can start getting people to understand what a healthy body looks like, as opposed to this false idea of a perfect body, we can be a lot more functional that way.
Yeah, I think that it's so important for men to hear this as well because it's a challenge in today's culture. You know, it's funny. I was even flying in the airport yesterday and there was this photo of what looked like could be, you know, maybe a 14, 15-year-old teenager. And I'm staring at the photo and I'm like, she's a child. And I can tell this photo has been so heavily photoshopped. You know, you can really intensely see the very back of her jawbone all the way back near her ear. There are different parts of her body where, you know, in some respects, I'm looking at her, I can tell that they've made her look very skinny, either artificially or through an eating disorder in order to create that unrealistic photo. And when you wanted to talk about body dysmorphia among men, we discuss it with women, but we don't talk about how, yes, actually, some of the images we're seeing with men are also fake and cropped and edited to recreate and create this ideal that is unrealistic in terms of, both, one, if it is real, how much time a man took to get there, or two, if it isn't even real based on how it's been photoshopped or used the latest technologies in order to look that way.
Yeah, and look, there's a reason why this industry is so big. Forget about the plastic surgeons. Let's just talk about all the performance-enhancing drugs, younger and younger guys getting on steroids, the supplement market. This is all because these companies know that people are struggling with how they look because they're chasing an unattainable idea. And Photoshop and social media have made that worse. I remember growing up as a kid, in the back of the comic books I used to read was always a Charles Atlas ad. A skinny guy on the beach getting sand kicked in his face, and then he does this workout program from Charles Atlas, and now he's this big muscular guy on the beach. It's always been a thing, but I think that now the prevalence of it is astronomical, and we're seeing kids younger and younger deal with it. And to me, that's really frightening, because we're missing out again on what it means to be a healthy human being, as opposed to what it means to have a body that looks the way you want. You may look the way you want, but not be healthy. And that's a problem.
Yes. And that's the challenge, I think, for all of us. We've shifted our perspective of understanding and knowing through our basic education, our human anthropology, that we have a body and we have a soul, and both matter. Instead, we've lived in such a digital culture that we struggle today. We struggle to focus on the facade of our body, not even on the actual completeness of our body, not the innards of our body, not on the proper functioning. It's just, how does this look, and how can I get there to look this way? Or how can I fix this symptom I am experiencing, whether psychologically or physically? And that damages our soul, and it does damage our body as well when we're not looking at the whole picture. And so I think that this bodily dysmorphia is such an important conversation, because men need to be able to pursue, just as women do, that there's a great love and respect for who I am, how I was created, and that I am also, we talk to women about how we're uniquely created and intentionally, but we don't talk to men about that. But at the same time, when you say that, Jim, it kind of sounds feminine to even talk about our body image. So how do you get over that feminine sound to approaching the issue of bodily dysmorphia?
So I think one of the best ways to do it, and you know, and your listeners who have heard me before know, I've been involved in the martial arts for over 30 years.
Yes.
I love it. I think it's a great way to relieve stress, actually to grow in virtue, like our last segment talked about, but also to understand what it means to be functionally healthy. And that's where we should be driving our bodies, to functional strength. What are the things we need to do in our life, and are we strong enough to do them? I challenge people all the time in my self-defense programs. If you had to run a mile to save your life, could you? Yes, I could. Great. Could you do it 25% faster? Well, if I tried, well, maybe that's something we should be working on. Like, let's do things that make sense, as opposed to spending 4 hours a day in a gym, which I know some men do, to just look a certain way. But functionally, they couldn't run a mile to save their life, or their diet is so protein heavy, they're going to have kidney stones and other problems. Let's look at health from a holistic standpoint, the way God created our body. our soul, our mind. All of that has to be tied in, and then you're truly healthy and in shape, my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. You mean you're not into this whole carnivore diet trend that's going around of just eating meat and liver?
I am not, and nor will I be.
That's a whole nother conversation for another day. I joke, my husband is totally like, okay, well, what do you think about the carnivore diet? I'm like, no, you're not eating just meat. You're
No,
listening to
not
Trending with
healthy.
Timmerie. No, you're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. That's Jim O'Day, the Executive Director of Integrity Restored. Jim can be found at integrityrestored.com. And in our brief moments, Jim, can you share a little bit about an upcoming retreat that's available for women who have been impacted by a pornographic impact on their relationship, their marriage, and so forth?
Yeah, wives, girlfriends, when they are faced with the man that they love dealing with a pornography addiction or compulsion, regular use, they're going to suffer from something called betrayal trauma. And it manifests itself very similar to PTSD. And so they're not going to know what's going on, what's happening. But help is available. And this Divine Mercy Weekend in April, we have a virtual retreat, a virtual healing retreat called Hope Blooms. And this is the 5th or 6th one that we've put on. The healing for women has been amazing. It's run by Dee Yarrison and Laura Ercolino from Hope's Garden, 2 women who have tremendous experience and compassion in dealing with this issue, and Father Alan Hoffa, our theological advisor.
Excellent.
Go to
if you're interested in registering, yes, integrityrestored.com. We'll include a link in the podcast shows for today's show. Again, integrityrestored.com. The link will be in the podcast notes for today's show at relevantradio.com/trending. I'll be right back.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
It's your weekly marriage hour today on Trending. Actually, our marriage hour is tomorrow. Today's Gentleman's Hour. Gentlemen, I'd love to hear from you. The number's 1-888-914-9149. David had a comment in Sacramento as we were talking about this challenge today that men are experiencing surrounding, we want men to be men, but at the same time, we tell them to disregard everything that personifies manliness. David, what's your comment about our topic? You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Next Friday, Pope Francis will consecrate Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary during the celebration of penance in St. Peter's Basilica, while a papal envoy will do the same in Fatima. Be sure to join Relevant Radio next Friday morning for this special live coverage from Rome. As we prepare for this historic event, we invite you to join Drew Mariani daily at 3 p.m. Central as he prays a novena for peace. Thursday, be sure to join Drew Mariani as he continues his 9-day novena peace as we prepare our hearts for this historic event. Be sure to gather your family together each night as our prayers continue to pray for peace in Ukraine and continue during the family rosary across America. I also want to invite you during the celebration of penance coming up on the 25th of March. I'd like to invite you to go to your local parish for confession this week or before March 25th. Now is the time. In the world of uncertainty, we tend to be reminded with war and various things happening around us of the certainty of death as uncertainty surrounds us. And it reminds us of the need we have for God's mercy as well as the desire we have to be with him in heaven. So prepare the way of the Lord to work in your life. Go to confession, receive his mercy. I want to invite you to do so this week before March 25th when the consecration of Russia to Our Lady is made. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. If you haven't joined us, we're walking through the Lenten lessons on the Mass with Father Rocky. Each day, delivered to your inbox, you receive a little nugget of information and knowledge to help you fall in love with Mass. And today, Father Rocky talked about the Collect, which is a prayer that is prayed right near the beginning of the Mass. It's an opening prayer right after the Gloria is concluded, and there's that moment of let us pray and of silence. And the Collect is a prayer that is usually centered on the theme of the Mass. And I thought this was significant, especially as we're about to celebrate the World Feast Day of St. Patrick's Day. Everyone uses this opportunity to drink, even if they're not Catholic, of remembering how this feast day, whether it be St. Patrick's Day or Our Lady of Fatima or the Annunciation that's coming up, that these days are opportunities for us to dive more deeply into our faith, to experience the season of the church, and to live liturgically, to breathe with the breath of the church. And I think that this collect prayer that we find right there at the beginning of the Mass is a reminder of what the saint's feast day is that we're celebrating, who that saint is, how they died for Christ, whether a martyr's death or not a martyr's death. This is one of the reasons why I love going to daily Mass, because you get to hear and celebrate and be with these saints day in and day out, and they are true inspiration for our lives. And if there's not a given saint particularly asked to be celebrated in a particular day, what's neat is you'll learn that there are rhythms throughout the week of particular saints or focuses, such as on Friday we focus on the Passion of Christ, Sunday the Resurrection, Wednesday is a special Mass for St. Joseph, Saturday is a special Mass for Our Lady. And so in those collect prayers, the opening prayers in the Mass that are customized, you receive so many I think benefits from understanding who that saint is or what that theme is, to walk with you through the entire Mass as you meditate and pray with our Lord. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. I wanted to talk today, especially as we're approaching, God willing, the overturning of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, which legalized abortion through all 9 months of a woman's pregnancy across the nation. We've seen many laws over the last 30 years passed to decrease access to abortion, and as we approach potentially the overturning of Roe versus Wade coming up this June, many states are battling, and they're battling state to state to put pro-life or radically pro-abortion laws on the book, laws that would determine whether you live in a pro-life state protecting human life, or in a state that is a so-called abortion sanctuary state, such as California is trying to be, versus a Mississippi or a Texas that would become a pro-life state. And so what's happening is, as we see this battle turning to the states, we see these conversations rekindling in our relationships with family and friends and maybe even coworkers, or maybe the debates taken online, and we're hearing some of the toughest or at times easiest arguments to respond to when it comes to abortion. But one thing I see over and over again is that while we may hold to a particularly pro-life position, sometimes, just like with our faith, we cower when it comes to the response that we're called to give, to defend human life, to defend women, and to truly hold to, whether it be our Catholic position or our pro-life position, whether our faith is being attacked or whether there's a justification for killing a baby in the womb. And when it comes to pro-life responses, I want to share with you one tool that is so helpful for responding to pro-abortion questions. It's one of the very first things I ever learned that allowed me, just a day after learning it, to go out on the streets in Hollywood and all over and do what was called, what was known as, truth projects, where we'd stand out there with signs about fetal development in some of the busiest areas in Hollywood and LA, public sidewalk, it's your right to be there, and you'd talk to pedestrians about the life issue, and I would hear some of the most challenging arguments that people could possibly make for why a child should be able to be aborted. And this is an important topic because I think we have two fronts that we have to confront the abortion issue on. One front is the fact that we've completely dehumanized the child to the point where the pro-abortion movement believes that abortion is a necessary evil. On the other front, we have to confront the crisis and challenge where people are saying, well, abortion is necessary for women to flourish. And we talk a lot about that side of the abortion debate here on Trending. But today I want to focus on an acronym that will help you in responding to any pro-abortion argument. It was developed by Stephen Schwartz in his book, The Moral Question of Abortion. And anytime someone asks me about or challenges me on the pro-life issue and justifies why they think it's okay to abort a baby, I always come back to this acronym known as SLED. Each letter stands for one thing. S stands for size, L stands for level of development, E stands for environment, and D stands for degree of dependency. Really, every argument that a person could make to justify abortion really comes back to justifying why, essentially, big people can kill little people based on size, level of development, environment, or their degree of dependency. So, for example, when it comes to size, people will argue that they should be able to abort children, and especially they think it's okay in the earliest months of pregnancy, especially in that first trimester. In fact, a lot of the country is pro-life. They don't think that third trimester abortion should be legal, and many people don't even think that second trimester abortion should be legal. But I know many people who quote-unquote call themselves pro-life who say, well, I am okay with, early abortion, first trimester. And they try to give all these reasons why. But ultimately, this comes back to the issue of size. Does how big you are determine who you are? Just because you and I are bigger, does that mean that big people can pick on little people? It's actually bullying, and that's what we're doing to the children in the womb. It's interesting. If we bring this back to size, can we kill anyone who's smaller than us because they're smaller? They're more dependent. Should we be able to kill toddlers because they're smaller than you and I? Should we be able to kill, and someone will say, well, no, you can't kill a toddler. That's not right. Well, why not? And they'll give all these reasons as to why they don't think it's okay to kill a toddler, but they're okay with abortion. And so there's this other tactic that you can bring in known as trot out the toddler, where most everyone will agree that it's not okay to just completely get rid of and ignore a toddler, to kill a toddler, to put a gun to a toddler's head. But they're okay with essentially doing the same thing with a different instrument for a baby in the womb. And so you use that trot out the toddler example when it comes to size, because if they're not okay with a toddler, well, you keep taking it further and further back into an earlier stage of development. So they're not okay with the toddler. So you say, okay, well, what about a newborn? They're still going to object to a newborn. You say, well, okay, what about the week before that baby's born? And you keep pushing it further and further back, and you see the closer in proximity you are to their original objection of not killing a toddler or a newborn, you help them to see that all of these are strictly areas of size or level of development. And so that takes us to the next area. In that SLED acronym, S stands for size, L for level of development. And this is one question that we can ask. Are 20-year-olds more human than 10-year-olds since they are smarter and stronger? Should we be able to kill a person based on how developed they are? All of us human beings are various levels of development. The preborn are less developed than a born person. I even think about when I was dancing growing up. I danced and did point, jazz, tap, all of that. But I remember the big thing, if you ever danced and you did ballet, was when do I get to go on point? When do I get to wear those point shoes? Little do people realize after many years on point, you don't realize how tiring and painful it can be. But those days on point, I remember I waited and I waited. And part of the reason why I waited to go on point wasn't just because of talent and capability and proficiency, but at a certain point, especially as the girls go through puberty, there's a part of the ankle that is developed. And until those parts of the ankle are developed, it's actually not healthy for a young girl to be put on point. And so I give this example because we could use the example, well, because I didn't have all of the development of an adult ankle, should we have been able to kill me? Or because the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop, the area of reason in the human being doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25, should we be able to kill anyone under 25? And so we continue to walk through these arguments. The E in this acronym SLED stands for environment. Does being inside a house make you more or less a person than being outside of a house? That argument, I think, is so important because we justify killing a baby as long as the baby's in the womb. the legality of it is as long as the baby's head hasn't come out of the woman's body yet, we can actually still kill that baby. And so the only justification is because the baby's in the womb versus outside of the womb, we allow an individual to be killed. But it brings us back to this idea. Does location, environment, determine us to be less or more valuable? Is a person located in a hospital more or less valuable than a person in an office space working? And that degree of dependency, we'll continue to walk through the SLED acronym this week, especially tomorrow, because I want you to be equipped to dive into and respond to some of the most challenging abortion questions today, to break them down and to help other people transfer themselves to a pro-life position. Dating, marriage, relationships, how do we communicate the goal of dating, how to work through relationships, and how to maintain healthy marriages, whether you've been married a few months or a number of decades. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. I hope you'll join us during our weekly marriage hour every Thursday on Trending, where we take your questions as well as the toughest issues confronting dating, relationships, and marriage. So join me every Thursday for our weekly marriage hour, 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.